Hi everyone, welcome to Voluntarily. My name's Andrew Watkins, and today I want to take you on a very brief tour of how we make API calls into the system. So I have open here a checkout of the Voluntarily 2 code base into a folder called VLE test, and we're going to be looking at the server folder and an API child folder. And in here I've created an example called health. And this is a simple API call that's going to return whether the system is healthy or not. So we're putting pathways to, or the URLs that we want to be able to handle in files that are called something.root.js. And I'll show you why that is in a second. And in here we've written a very simple express server function. We're going to export from this folder a function that takes a server, which we'll pass in with the express server, and then adds these routes to the system. So that when the server is called with a get HTTP call, and the path is API health, we're going to call the get health function, and that's going to return the response. And then there's a couple of other examples of how we can parameterize the URLs. So if we call the API with health and then another word, we'll call get health again, or with two words, and we'll also call get health, and the function there will handle the different results. The actual get health function's in health controller, and all of these functions have the same structure. They take a request and they return a result, and all they have to do is call status, in this case if it's successful 200, and as they're API calls, we're typically going to return JSON with the contents of an object that we've created. If this was an HTTP call for an HTML response, then we would just return the HTML string here. But APIs in our system are always going to be returning JSON. The advantage of that is that we can create a standard JavaScript object and we'll just return it with no extra work. So there's not a lot in here, and in fact, currently we're not actually doing any health checks. We're just going to say the health is always okay. We're returning a message which at some point we'll put the build number in, and then just as an illustration, we'll return the request parameters and the request query that have been passed in to show how you'll be able to use those later on. So let's see what that looks like in practice. So here I'm running the system with npm run dev, and I visited localhost 3122, which is our test port, and I'm visiting API health, and you'll see it just comes back with a JSON object. It actually looks like this, but when it's pretty printed, it looks like this, which is exactly the object that we sent out. And it's not showing that there are any parameters. So now if I put in some query parameters, and because we're not interpreting it, it doesn't matter what we did. So let's say I wanted to ask for information about source equals DB. Okay, so now we see that the query is returning us a source record with the DB, and we can add extra parameters like test1, and they'll just appear there, which is cool. And similarly, if we add extra parameters on the URL path name, so we could say, instead of that, we could say test/db, then you'll see that they appear in the parameters request there. So it's all very straightforward. The question is, how does this actually get run? So to do that, we take a look at server.js, which is the entry point for our whole application. And it's quite a big file, but all it really does is load up a whole bunch of key objects, the Node.js Express server, and Mongoose to give us access to the database, and Next to handle some of the underlying functionality that we're using. We load some language information, and then as we start to prepare the application, we set up the server to parse JSON, to use languages, to handle CORS requests, we start the database, and then here we pull in the routes. So actually here we is where we pass all unhandled API routes onto router handler, which is a Next.js function, and that's the one that will direct everything to the pages and the subpages and the page components. So we'll come back to that another day. But before we get to passing everything else onto there, we want to pick up the API routes that we've created, and rather than load them all individually, this glob searches our route path, for which is server API, for any file that ends in routes.js. And if it's not a .spec.js, if it's not a test, then it requires it and passes it in the server. And so that generates that basically calls that get function and adds it to calls the route, adds it to the server, so that when we visit that location, we'll get the result. All very straightforward, and that's it for today.